The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the general store, and Felicity Rose couldn't stop her hands from trembling as she clutched her worn leather bag against her chest, every sound making her flinch like a startled rabbit, ready to bolt into the underbrush. It was late summer in 1882, and Grass Valley, California stretched before her in the golden afternoon light, a collection of wooden buildings and dusty streets that seemed both foreign and terrifying to a woman who had spent her entire 22 years in a cramped Philadelphia boarding house, surrounded by walls and whispers. The journey west had been a nightmare of noises and strangers, every jolt of the coach convincing her they would overturn, every stop at a way station filling her with dread that bandits would descend upon them with guns blazing. Her benefactress, Mrs. Henderson, had arranged everything through careful correspondence, assuring Felicity that marriage to a respectable California rancher would provide the security and safety she desperately needed. But now, standing on the wooden sidewalk with dust settling around her skirts, Felicity wondered if she had made the greatest mistake of her life. A man approached from across the street, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dusty work clothes and a hat that shaded his face. Felicity's breath caught in her throat, and she took an involuntary step backward, nearly stumbling over her own bag, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Miss Rose." His voice was deep but surprisingly gentle, and when he removed his hat, she saw a face weathered by sun and wind, strong features softened by concerned brown eyes that studied her with unexpected kindness. He appeared to be perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that needed a trim and hands that looked capable of hard work. "I'm Yates Lawson. We've been corresponding these past 4 months. Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. Felicity forced herself to meet his eyes, though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to run, to hide. A wagon rumbled past behind her, and she jumped violently, a small cry escaping her lips. Yates Lawson's expression shifted from polite greeting to something deeper, a crease forming between his brows. He made no move to touch her or come closer, instead standing perfectly still as though afraid of startling her further. "Miss Rose, are you all right?" "I'm fine." Another lie. She was never fine. The world was too loud, too vast, too filled with dangers she couldn't name but felt in every fiber of her being. Back in Philadelphia, she had rarely left the boarding house, and when she did, it was always with Mrs. Henderson's firm grip on her arm, guiding her through streets that seemed designed to swallow young women whole. "Your journey must have been difficult," Yates said, his voice still gentle, still careful. "The stage from Sacramento is rough, and before that, the train across the territories." He paused, seeming to choose his words with deliberate care. "My ranch is about 3 miles outside of town. I have a wagon waiting, but if you'd prefer to rest first, perhaps get something to eat at the hotel, we can do that. There's no hurry." The thought of sitting in a public dining room, surrounded by strangers and their noise and their eyes, made Felicity's stomach clench with anxiety. But the alternative, climbing into a wagon with this man she had never met and traveling to an isolated ranch, seemed equally terrifying. She stood frozen, unable to make a decision, her fingers tightening on her bag until her knuckles turned white. "Or," Yates continued, watching her face with those observant eyes, "I could ask Mrs. Patterson at the general store to fix us a basket, and we could eat here on the bench outside in the open air. Might be nice after being cooped up in that stage." Something about the way he offered options, the way he seemed to sense her fear without mocking it or demanding explanation, loosened the tight band around Felicity's chest just slightly. "The basket," she managed. "That would be acceptable." Yates nodded and turned toward the store, but before entering, he looked back at her. "I'll be just inside, right through that door. You can see me the whole time through the window." He disappeared into the dim interior, and Felicity watched through the glass as he spoke with a plump woman behind the counter, gesturing occasionally toward the street. True to his word, she could see him clearly, and somehow that helped. The minutes ticked by, marked by the beating of her anxious heart, and then he emerged with a covered basket and a canteen. "Mrs. Patterson packed cold chicken, bread, some cheese, and apple pie," he said, setting the basket on the bench beside Felicity but maintaining a respectful distance between them. "She's the best cook in Grass Valley, and she was excited to hear you'd arrived safely. Said she'll call on you once you're settled, if that would be welcome." Felicity managed a small nod, though the thought of visitors made her nervous. She perched on the edge of the bench, every muscle tense, while Yates unpacked the food with steady, unhurried movements. He handed her a cloth napkin, a plate, and portions of food, never once letting his hands come too close to hers. "I should tell you about the ranch," he said, more to fill the silence than anything, Felicity suspected. "It's called the Broken Creek Ranch, named for the stream that runs through the property. Got about 300 acres, maybe 80 head of cattle right now, some horses. It's good land, fertile when we get rain, stubborn when we don't." He took a bite of bread, chewing thoughtfully. "The house is solid. Built it myself with help from my neighbor, Tom Miller. 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a sitting room. There's a root cellar and a barn that's newer than the house." Felicity forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like dust in her mouth. She was aware of people passing on the street, of the sounds of hammering from somewhere nearby, of dogs barking and children laughing. Each noise made her shoulders tighten. "Miss Rose," Yates said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up. His eyes were serious, kind, and entirely focused on her. "I don't know what you've been through, and I won't ask unless you want to tell me, but I want you to know something, and I need you to believe it." He paused, seeming to gather his words. "Out at the ranch on my land, you're safe. Whatever you're afraid of, whatever makes you jump at shadows, it won't find you there. I give you my word on that." "How can you promise such a thing?" The question emerged before Felicity could stop it, tinged with all the desperation and doubt she carried. "The world is full of dangers. Accidents happen. People get hurt. Bad things come whether we want them or not." "Bad things do happen," Yates acknowledged. "Lost my parents to fever when I was 19. Lost my best horse to a broken leg last spring. Life has hard edges, no denying that." He set down his plate and leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "But fear and being careful are different things. Being careful is good. It keeps you alive. Fear, that stops you from living, that makes every moment a torment, that's something else entirely." He drew a breath. "I can't promise nothing will ever go wrong. But I can promise I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe and comfortable. And I can promise I won't be one of the things you need to fear." Something in Felicity's chest cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough to let in a sliver of something that might have been hope. She had feared that Yates Lawson would be cruel or impatient or dismissive of her anxieties. Mrs. Henderson had warned her that Western men were often rough, demanding husbands who expected obedience without question. But this man, with his gentle voice and careful distance, seemed different from what she had imagined. "I'm not brave," she whispered. "I've never been brave. I'm afraid of storms and loud noises and strangers and horses and gunfire and illness and 1,000 other things I can't even name. You should know that before we go any further. You should know what you're getting." "I don't need you to be brave," Yates said simply. "I just need you to be willing to try. We'll go slow. We'll take things one day at a time. And whenever you're scared, you tell me, and we'll figure it out together." The words were so foreign to Felicity's experience that she almost couldn't process them. In the boarding house, her fears had been dismissed as foolishness, weakness, feminine hysteria. Mrs. Henderson had been kind, but even she had pushed Felicity to overcome her terrors through sheer force of will, as though fear were something that could be reasoned away with enough determination. "All right," Felicity heard herself say. "I'll try." They finished their meal in relative silence, though it felt less oppressive now, more companionable. When they were done, Yates packed away the remains and returned the basket to Mrs. Patterson, then retrieved Felicity's trunk from the stage office. He loaded everything into a sturdy wagon hitched to two patient-looking horses, then offered Felicity his hand to help her up to the seat. She stared at his outstretched palm for a long moment, her heart racing. Physical contact had always been difficult, too intimate, too unpredictable. But she placed her trembling hand in his, and his grip was firm but not crushing, warm but not possessive. He helped her onto the seat and then released her immediately, giving her space before climbing up himself. "These are Rosie and Dale," he said, nodding toward the horses. "They're gentle as lambs and steady as sunrise, never spooked once in all the years I've had them." The wagon lurched into motion and Felicity gripped the edge of the seat, her knuckles white. But Yates kept the pace slow and even, navigating the rutted road with practiced ease. They left Grass Valley behind, heading into rolling hills covered in dry grass the color of honey, dotted here and there with oak trees that provided islands of shade in the golden landscape. "It's beautiful," Felicity said, surprised by her own words. But it was true. The vastness that had terrified her when she first stepped off the stage now seemed almost peaceful in its emptiness. There was space here, room to breathe, distances between herself and the things that frightened her. "Wait until winter," Yates said with a slight smile. "The hills turn green and wildflowers come up everywhere. Creek runs full and cold with snowmelt from the higher elevations. It's a sight worth seeing. You get harsh winters here. Nah, not like back east. Gets cold at night and we get rain, sometimes pretty hard, but nothing like the blizzards you probably knew in Philadelphia. We're lucky that way." They talked in fits and starts as the wagon rolled onward, Yates sharing details about the ranch, the neighbors, the rhythms of life in this part of California. Felicity listened more than she spoke, but gradually, incrementally, she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The sun was warm without being oppressive, and the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels became almost soothing. When they crested a low rise, Yates pointed ahead. "There it is. That's home." The Broken Creek Ranch spread out before them in a small valley, the house a sturdy wooden structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney. The barn stood nearby, larger and clearly well-maintained, with a corral beside it where several horses grazed. Beyond that, Felicity could see the glint of water where the creek cut through the property, bordered by willows and cottonwoods. Cattle dotted the hillsides, dark shapes against the golden grass. "It's not fancy," Yates said, a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. "But it's solid and comfortable. I've tried to make it a good place." "It's lovely," Felicity said, and meant it. There was something appealing about the simplicity, the honesty of it. No pretense, no hidden corners, just a straightforward home carved out of the California landscape through hard work and determination. As they drew closer, a dog emerged from the porch, barking a greeting. Felicity tensed immediately and Yates noticed. "That's just Scout," he said. "Border collie, smart as they come. He's friendly, but I can put him in the barn if dogs worry you." "I've never really been around dogs," Felicity admitted. "Will he jump on me?" "Not if I tell him not to." Yates pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, then walked over to the dog, who was wagging his entire back half in excitement. "Scout, sit." The dog sat immediately, though his tail continued to sweep the dust. Yates scratched behind his ears, then turned to Felicity. "Stay there a minute. Let me introduce you proper." He came around to help Felicity down from the wagon, and she descended carefully, her legs stiff from the journey. Scout remained seated, watching with bright, intelligent eyes. "Scout, this is Miss Rose. She's going to be living here now, and you need to be gentle with her. No jumping, no barking unless there's real trouble. Understand?" The dog's tail wagged faster, and Yates led Felicity forward slowly. "You can pet him if you want or not. Your choice." Felicity hesitated, then extended a shaking hand. Scout's fur was soft under her fingers, and when he turned his head to lick her wrist gently, she didn't pull away. Something about the simple affection in the gesture touched her unexpectedly. "Good boy," Yates murmured. "All right, go on now. Give us some space." Scout trotted off toward the barn, and Yates led Felicity to the house. The porch was swept clean, with 2 rocking chairs and a small table between them. He opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but as her eyes adjusted, Felicity took in the main room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a comfortable-looking sofa and chairs arranged before it. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that looked well-read. The floors were wooden but covered here and there with woven rugs. Everything was clean and orderly, a bachelor's careful maintenance evident in every corner. "Kitchen's through there," Yates said, pointing to an open doorway. "I'm no great cook, but I manage. Been eating a lot of stew and beans, if I'm honest. Hope you like to cook, or we'll both be learning together." He showed her the bedrooms, both simply furnished but clean. The larger one had clearly been his, with personal items scattered about, but he was already moving things out. "I'll take the smaller room," he said. "You should have the bigger one, more space for your things." "We're not married yet," Felicity said, suddenly aware of the impropriety of the situation. "We should have a chaperone, or I should stay in town or something." "Thought about that," Yates admitted. "If you want, I can ride back and ask Mrs. Patterson or one of the other ladies to come stay for a while until we can arrange the wedding, or I can sleep in the barn. Whatever makes you most comfortable." The idea of a stranger in the house made Felicity more anxious than being alone with Yates. At least with him, she was starting to understand his patterns, his gentleness. A new person would mean recalibrating all her defenses. "The barn seems extreme," she said carefully. "Perhaps if you keep to the smaller room and I keep to the larger and we're both proper about it, that would be acceptable." "The wedding could be soon, couldn't it? Tomorrow, if you wanted," Yates said. "Though I thought you might want a few days to settle in, get your bearings." "We could get married at the end of the week, maybe. Saturday. Give you time to feel ready." The consideration in his words, the way he kept giving her choices and time, was almost overwhelming. Felicity nodded, not trusting her voice. Over the next few days, a routine began to establish itself. Yates rose early to tend to the animals and see to the ranch work, while Felicity explored the house and began to make it feel like her own. She found cooking came more naturally than she'd expected, and there was satisfaction in preparing meals from the supplies. Yates kept well stocked in the pantry and root cellar. He had been right about his cooking skills being limited, but he was always appreciative of her efforts, complimenting even her simplest attempts. The house felt safe in a way Felicity had never experienced before. The walls were thick, the doors solid, and the location meant no immediate neighbors pressing close. She could see for miles in every direction, which meant nothing could approach without warning. At night, The silence was broken only by crickets and the occasional owl, sounds that became familiar rather than frightening. Yates was careful to maintain respectful boundaries, never entering her room without knocking, always giving her space when she seemed overwhelmed. But he also made efforts to include her in small aspects of ranch life, teaching her where things were kept, showing her how to gather eggs from the chickens he kept near the house, introducing her to the rhythms of his daily work. On the third day, he asked if she'd like to see the creek up close. Felicity was nervous about leaving the immediate area of the house, but curiosity won out. They walked together through the grass, Scout ranging ahead, and when they reached the water, Felicity was enchanted by the way it burbled over smooth stones, clear and cold even in the late summer heat. "It's fed by springs up in the hills," Yates explained. "Never runs dry, even in drought years. That's why this land is so valuable. Water means everything out here." Felicity sat on a large, flat rock near the bank, watching the play of light on the water. Yates sat nearby, not too close, and for a while they simply existed in the peaceful afternoon, the world reduced to water and stone and the rustle of leaves overhead. "Can I ask you something?" Yates said eventually, his tone careful. Felicity tensed but nodded. "What are you most afraid of?" "Not everything, just the worst one, the fear that's biggest." She was quiet for a long time, considering whether to answer, whether she could put it into words. Finally, she said, "Being hurt, being helpless while something terrible happens and not being able to stop it. The world feels so unpredictable, so full of violence and pain. I've seen it, read about it, heard about it my whole life. And I'm small and weak, and I wouldn't be able to defend myself or escape. So I just tried to make myself smaller to hide, to avoid anything that might bring danger close." "Has something bad happened to you before?" Yates asked gently. "Is that where the fear comes from?" "Not directly," Felicity admitted. "It's more that I've always been this way ever since I was a little girl. My mother died in childbirth when I was 7, and my father couldn't care for me, so I went to live with Mrs. Henderson. She ran the boarding house, and she was kind, but the other girls, the other residents, they told such awful stories. Murders and robberies and terrible accidents. And my father died too, a few years later in a factory accident. Everything always felt so fragile, like disaster was just waiting to strike." Yates was quiet, absorbing this. Then he said, "I won't lie and say bad things never happen. But I think maybe you've been carrying more weight than you need to. You're stronger than you think, Felicity. You came all the way across the country to a place you'd never seen to marry a man you'd never met. That took courage." "It took desperation," Felicity corrected. "Mrs. Henderson was selling the boarding house. I had nowhere else to go." "Maybe it started with desperation," Yates allowed. "But you still did it. And now you're here and you're trying. That counts for something." Felicity wanted to believe him, wanted to see herself through his eyes, as someone capable rather than pathetic. But a lifetime of fear was hard to set aside. Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. Yates hitched up the wagon, and they rode into Grass Valley together for the wedding. Felicity wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had been carefully preserved for special occasions, and she'd arranged her dark hair into a soft bun at the nape of her neck. The ceremony was brief, conducted by Reverend Matthews in the small church at the edge of town. Mrs. Patterson and her husband stood as witnesses, and a handful of townspeople gathered to observe, curious about the mail-order bride who had come all the way from Pennsylvania. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Yates leaned in slowly, giving Felicity time to pull away if she wanted. But she stayed still, and his kiss was chaste and gentle, barely a brush of lips, over almost before it began. "Mrs. Patterson insisted on hosting a small gathering at her home afterward, and though Felicity's anxiety spiked at the prospect, she found it wasn't as overwhelming as she'd feared. The people of Grass Valley seemed genuinely welcoming, their questions friendly rather than intrusive. Tom Miller, the neighbor Yates had mentioned, was there with his wife Sarah, and they promised to visit the ranch soon. By the time they returned to the ranch in the late afternoon, Felicity was exhausted from the strain of socializing, but she also felt a small glow of accomplishment. She had done it. She was married now, Mrs. Yates Lawson, with a home and a husband and a new life spreading before her. That night, Yates respected her need for space, bidding her good night outside her bedroom door with a soft smile. "Sleep well, wife," he said, and the words sent a flutter through her chest. "Good night, husband," she replied, trying out the unfamiliar term. As Felicity lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, she realized that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something approaching peace. The fear was still there, lurking at the edges of her consciousness, but it was quieter now, less insistent. The weeks that followed brought gradual changes. Yates continued his patient approach, never pushing Felicity beyond her comfort zone, but always encouraging her to try new things. He taught her to ride, starting with the gentlest mare on the ranch, a sweet-tempered horse named Daisy who responded to the lightest touch on the reins. The first time Felicity sat in the saddle, her terror was so acute she could barely breathe, but Yates walked beside her, keeping one hand on Daisy's bridle, his presence steady and reassuring. "You're doing fine," he kept saying. "Just fine. Daisy knows what she's doing and you're safe up there." Gradually, over many short sessions, Felicity's panic eased. She learned to feel the rhythm of the horse's movements, to trust that the animal had no desire to hurt her. Eventually, she could ride around the corral without Yates holding on, then venture out into the pasture with him riding alongside. The freedom of it surprised her. On horseback, she could see farther, move faster, access parts of the ranch that had been unreachable on foot. The world expanded, became less confining. Yates also taught her to shoot, recognizing that the fear of being helpless might be eased by having some means of self-defense. He started with a small revolver, showing her how to load it, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger smoothly rather than jerking it. The first shot made her scream and drop the gun, the noise and recoil shocking in their intensity. But Yates picked it up calmly, checked that it was still pointed in a safe direction, and handed it back to her. "Try again," he said. "You know what to expect now." By the end of the session, Felicity could hit the target he'd set up more often than not, and while she still flinched at the sound, she no longer dropped the gun. Afterward, Yates showed her where he kept it in the house, unloaded but accessible. "Probably won't ever need it," he said. "But now you know you could defend yourself if you had to. Maybe that helps with the fear." It did help, at least a little. The knowledge that she wasn't entirely helpless chipped away at some of the anxiety that had ruled her for so long. As autumn arrived, turning the hills briefly green before the dry season set in again, Felicity found herself settling into ranch life with increasing comfort. She took over most of the cooking and household management, finding satisfaction in creating a warm, welcoming home. She planted a small garden near the house, vegetables and herbs that thrived in the California climate. She learned the names and personalities of the cattle, the quirks of each horse, the patterns of the land, and slowly, carefully, her relationship with Yates deepened. They talked long into the evenings, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Yates told her about his childhood on a farm in Missouri, the journey west after his parents died, the years of hard work it had taken to build the ranch into something viable. Felicity shared her own history, the loneliness of the boarding house, the books that had been her only escape, the constant sense of being out of step with the world. They began to touch more casually, hands brushing as they passed dishes at dinner, his arm around her shoulders when they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, her fingers in his hair when he rested his head in her lap while she read aloud from one of his books. Each touch was a small negotiation, a question asked and answered with growing comfort. One night in late October, as they sat before the fireplace with the first real chill of approaching winter in the air, Yates took Felicity's hand in his. "I want you to know," he said, his voice low and serious, "that I'm not expecting anything from you. This marriage, it can be whatever we want it to be. If all you want is companionship and partnership, that's enough for me." Felicity looked at their joined hands, at the way his fingers, calloused from work, held hers with such care. She thought about the past months, about the patience he'd shown, the kindness, the respect. She thought about how the fear that had defined her entire life had begun to recede, replaced by something warmer and more substantial. "What if I want more?" she asked quietly. Yates's breath caught. "Then we'll go slow," he said. "As slow as you need. And you can stop anytime, change your mind anytime. Your comfort matters more than anything else." She turned to face him fully, and in the firelight his face was open and honest, every emotion visible. She realized that somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she had fallen in love with this gentle, patient man who had promised she would be safe and had kept that promise every single day. "Kiss me," she whispered. "Really kiss me, not like at the wedding." Yates cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, giving her one last chance to reconsider. Then he leaned in, and this kiss was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding. It was warm and deep and full of the months of patient restraint finally being released. Felicity melted into it, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, anchoring herself to him as the world narrowed to just this moment, this connection. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have for weeks now, but I didn't want to rush you." "I love you too," Felicity replied, and the words felt like a revelation, like a door opening to a room she hadn't known existed. "I was so afraid when I came here, afraid of everything, but you were exactly what you promised. Safe. Steady. You never pushed, never demanded, never made me feel weak for being scared." "You were never weak," Yates said firmly. "Scared, yes, but weakness and fear aren't the same thing. You're one of the strongest people I know." That night, they moved into the same bedroom, and Yates showed Felicity with infinite patience and gentleness that physical intimacy didn't have to be frightening, that it could be beautiful and connecting and safe. He checked in with her constantly, made sure she was comfortable, stopped when she needed to breathe and collect herself. And afterward, as they lay tangled together under the quilts, Felicity felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. The seasons turned, and their love deepened. Winter brought rains that turned the hills emerald green and filled the creek to rushing abundance. Yates had been right about the wildflowers, too. In spring, the hillsides exploded with color, brilliant orange poppies and purple lupines and golden mustard creating a patchwork quilt across the landscape. Felicity spent hours walking through the flowers, sometimes alone, sometimes with Yates, marveling at the beauty of this place that had become her home. They attended church socials and community gatherings in Grass Valley, and Felicity gradually built friendships with the other women in the area. Sarah Miller became a particular confidante, stopping by for tea and conversation, sharing advice about everything from cooking to dealing with the challenges of ranch life. The fear that had once made such socializing impossible hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer ruled Felicity's life. She had learned to manage it, to push through it when necessary, to accept that some anxiety was normal and didn't have to be paralyzing. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Felicity proved to have a good head for numbers, and she took over the bookkeeping, finding ways to maximize their resources and plan for the future. Yates expanded the herd carefully, never overextending, building the operation with the same patient steadiness he brought to everything else. They talked about their dreams, about maybe building a larger house someday, about children, about growing old together in this valley they both loved. In the summer of 1883, a year after Felicity's arrival in Grass Valley, she discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a complex swirl of emotions. Joy and excitement, certainly, but also a resurgence of the old fears. What if something went wrong? What if she wasn't a good mother? What if the child inherited her anxious nature? Yates held her as she cried through the panic, then pulled back to look her in the eyes. "Fear nothing here," he said, echoing the promise he'd made on that first day. "We'll face this together, just like we've faced everything else. And our child will be loved and safe because we'll make sure of it." Dr. Stevens, the physician in Grass Valley, was reassuring during her examinations, and Sarah Miller shared her own experiences with pregnancy and childbirth, demystifying the process. As Felicity's body changed and the baby grew within her, she found a new kind of strength. She was creating life, sustaining it, preparing to bring a new person into the world. It was terrifying and miraculous in equal measure. The pregnancy progressed without major complications, though Felicity had days of terrible nausea, and others where her back ached so badly she could barely move. Yates was attentive through all of it, taking on extra household tasks, making sure she rested, reading to her in the evenings when she was too tired to do anything else. In early March of 1884, on a night when the stars seemed impossibly bright and close, Felicity went into labor. Yates rode for Mrs. Patterson and Sarah Miller, who served as midwives, then stayed close throughout the long, painful hours that followed. He held Felicity's hand, wiped her forehead with cool cloths, murmured encouragement when she was convinced she couldn't continue. When their son finally emerged, red-faced and wailing his indignation at the world, Felicity felt a love so fierce and immediate it nearly stopped her heart. Yates cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and when Mrs. Patterson placed the cleaned and swaddled baby in Felicity's arms, the world reoriented around this tiny, perfect person. "What should we name him?" Yates asked, his voice rough with emotion. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, going back and forth between options. Now, looking at her son's face, Felicity said, Samuel Lawson." "Samuel," Yates repeated, testing it. "It's perfect. He's perfect." He kissed Felicity's forehead, then his son's. "You did so well, love. I'm so proud of you." The first weeks with Samuel were exhausting and overwhelming. The baby seemed to need constant attention, feeding every few hours, crying for reasons Felicity couldn't always decipher. Her body ached from the birth, and she was so tired she sometimes fell asleep sitting up. But Yates was there for all of it, walking the floor with Samuel when Felicity needed to sleep, changing diapers, marveling aloud at every tiny sound and movement their son made. Gradually, they found their rhythm. Samuel settled into more predictable patterns, and Felicity's body healed. She discovered that while motherhood brought new fears, it also brought fierce protectiveness that outweighed the anxiety. When Samuel was threatened by even the smallest thing, a too hot sun or a cold breeze, Felicity acted without hesitation, her instinct to protect her child overriding her natural timidity. Watching Yates with their son deepened Felicity's love even further. He was patient and gentle, delighting in every milestone, every smile, every new sound. He built a cradle that rocked smoothly beside their bed and carved little wooden animals for Samuel to play with as he grew. He sang nonsense songs that made the baby coo and laugh, and he never complained about the sleepless nights or the disruption to their routine. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. Tom Miller and Yates partnered on a few ventures, combining their herds for cattle drives to San Francisco, maximizing their profits. The extra income allowed them to make improvements to the property, expanding the barn, building a proper smokehouse, adding a room to the house for Samuel. Felicity's garden flourished, and she began preserving food for the winter months, her pantry shelves lined with jars of vegetables and fruits, jams and pickles. She taught herself to bake bread that Yates declared was better than anything he'd ever tasted, and she experimented with recipes shared by the other women in the community. Samuel was a curious, energetic child who seemed to inherit his mother's intelligence and his father's steady temperament. By the time he was 2, he was following Yates around the ranch, helping with chores in the way that toddlers do, mostly creating more work, but doing so with such enthusiasm that neither parent had the heart to discourage him. In the spring of 1886, Felicity discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news brought more excitement than fear. She knew what to expect now, and she had confidence in her ability to handle it. The pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she was less anxious, perhaps just because every pregnancy is different. Their daughter, Rebecca, was born in December of 1886, a Christmas baby with dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same warm brown as her father's. Samuel, now almost 3, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her constantly, bringing her his favorite toys to play with even though she was far too young. The house that had once seemed spacious now felt comfortably full. The sounds of children's laughter and occasional crying, the chaos of daily life with 2 small people who needed constant attention, all of it felt right to Felicity in a way she never could have imagined during her frightened early days in Grass Valley. Life settled into new patterns. Mornings began early with the demands of ranch work and children. Days were filled with the countless small tasks that made up their existence, cooking and cleaning, mending clothes and tending animals, teaching Samuel his letters and numbers, nursing Rebecca. Evenings found them all together, sometimes reading, sometimes just talking, Samuel playing with his toys while Rebecca slept in her cradle. Sundays they attended church in Grass Valley, the children dressed in their best clothes, Samuel holding tight to his father's hand while Felicity carried Rebecca. The community had fully embraced them now. Felicity was no longer the strange, frightened mail-order bride but simply Mrs. Lawson, a respected member of the town, known for her intelligence and her excellent cooking. The years passed with remarkable speed. Samuel started school in Grass Valley, riding in with Yates several days a week. Rebecca grew from infant to toddler to a small girl with strong opinions, and her mother's tendency to worry, though Felicity worked hard to ensure her daughter didn't develop the crippling anxiety that had marked her own childhood. In 1888, Felicity and Yates celebrated their 6th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner after the children were asleep. They sat on the porch in the warm summer evening, hands clasped, reflecting on how far they had come. "You remember when you first arrived?" Yates asked, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "How scared you were, how you jumped at every sound." "I remember," Felicity said. I was terrified, of you, of the ranch, of everything. I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. What changed?" Felicity thought about it, trying to pinpoint the exact moment. But there hadn't been one single revelation, one dramatic turning point. It had been 1,000 small moments, each one building on the last. Every time Yates had been patient with her fears. Every time he'd encouraged her to try something new but not forced her. Every time he'd kept his promise that she was safe. "You changed it," she said finally. "By being exactly what you said you'd be. By making me feel safe enough to take risks, to face the things that scared me. You gave me space to heal and grow." "You did the healing," Yates said. "I just provided the environment. You're the one who chose to be brave even when it was hard." "We did it together," Felicity countered. "That's what marriage is, isn't it? Two people making each other better, stronger. Supporting each other through the hard times." Yates pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, soap and sunshine and the faint smell of hay from his work. This man, who had been a stranger 6 years ago, was now the center of her world, along with their children. The life they had built together was more than she had ever hoped for. In 1890, Yates and Tom Miller decided to expand their operations significantly, purchasing additional land between their properties to create a larger, more efficient combined operation. The investment was substantial, requiring careful planning and considerable financial risk, but Felicity's bookkeeping had shown them they could manage it if they were smart about their resources. The expansion meant more work, but also more prosperity. They hired a ranch hand, a young man named David who was hardworking and reliable. The additional help meant Yates had more time to spend with the family, and Felicity was grateful for the extra presence around the ranch, especially as Samuel was now old enough to want to be more involved in the work. That summer, they finally built the larger house they had dreamed about years earlier. The new structure had 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen with a real cookstove, a dining room, and a sitting room with large windows that let in the golden California light. They kept the original house standing, converting it to additional storage and a space for any hired help. Moving into the new house felt like a celebration of everything they had achieved. Felicity arranged their furniture and belongings with care, creating spaces that were both functional and beautiful. She hung curtains she had sewn herself, placed the woven rugs Yates had purchased from a traveling merchant, arranged her growing collection of books on new shelves. Samuel, now 6, had his own room that he declared was the best room ever. Rebecca, at 3, was delighted to have more space to play. And Felicity and Yates finally had a bedroom that felt truly theirs, with room for the larger bed Yates built and space for Felicity's sewing area. Life in the new house was comfortable in a way their earlier existence hadn't quite been. There was room to breathe, space for everyone to have their own areas while still coming together for meals and family time. Felicity decorated with wildflowers from the hills, and the house smelled of baking bread and the herbs she dried from her garden. As the children grew older, they each developed distinct personalities. Samuel was serious and thoughtful, fascinated by how things worked. He could spend hours taking apart and reassembling machinery, and he showed an aptitude for working with the animals that made Yates beam with pride. Rebecca was more artistic, always drawing or making up stories, her imagination vivid and wild. She was also more sensitive than her brother, prone to tears and worries, and Felicity worked carefully to help her daughter learn to manage her emotions without letting them become overwhelming. In 1892, Yates took the whole family on a trip to San Francisco. It was Samuel's first time seeing the city, and Rebecca's first memory of it. They stayed in a modest hotel and spent 3 days exploring, seeing the harbor with its forest of ship masts, visiting markets full of goods from around the world, eating at restaurants that served food Felicity had never tasted before. The trip was exhausting but exhilarating. Samuel was fascinated by everything, asking endless questions about the ships and the people and the buildings. Rebecca was overwhelmed at times by the noise and crowds, clinging to Felicity's skirts, but she also delighted in the street performers and the fancy shop windows. For Felicity, the trip was a revelation. She realized how far she had come from the terrified young woman who had arrived in Grass Valley 10 years earlier. The city was loud and chaotic, full of strangers and unpredictability, all the things that would have paralyzed her with fear once upon a time. And while she wasn't entirely comfortable, she managed. She navigated the streets, spoke to shop clerks, made decisions about what to do and see. The anxiety was there, but it was manageable, a background hum rather than a roar that drowned out everything else. On their last evening in the city, as they watched the sun set over the bay, Yates put his arm around her waist. "You okay?" he asked quietly, attuned as always to her emotional state. "I'm wonderful," Felicity said and meant it. 10 years ago, I could never have done this. But now, with you beside me, I can do anything. You could always do anything, Yates said. You just needed to believe it. They returned to the ranch with stories to tell and memories to cherish. Life fell back into its familiar patterns, but with an added richness from having seen beyond their immediate world. The 1890s brought both challenges and triumphs. There was a drought year that tested their resources and their resolve, forcing difficult decisions about the herd and their finances. Felicity's careful bookkeeping and their savings saw them through, but it was a reminder that ranching was never entirely predictable or safe. There were good years, too, when the rains came in abundance, and the cattle thrived, and the profits were better than expected. They paid off the loan for the land expansion earlier than anticipated. They invested in improving their breeding stock, bringing in a quality bull that would strengthen the herd for years to come. The children continued to grow. Samuel became increasingly capable, taking on real responsibilities around the ranch. By the time he was 12, he could handle most tasks as well as a grown man, and Yates relied on him genuinely rather than just to make him feel included. Rebecca discovered a talent for music, and Felicity arranged for occasional lessons with Mrs. Henderson, a widow who had moved to Grass Valley and taught piano. The sound of Rebecca practicing filled the house, sometimes beautiful, sometimes painfully discordant, but always full of enthusiasm. In 1895, Felicity's old benefactress from Philadelphia, Mrs. Henderson, wrote to say she was ill and didn't have much time left. She wanted to see Felicity once more if possible, to know that the frightened girl she had sent west had found happiness. It was a difficult decision. The journey would be long and expensive, and leaving the ranch for the weeks it would require meant putting everything on Yates and Samuel. But Yates insisted she should go, that she needed to say goodbye properly, and show Mrs. Henderson that her faith in Felicity had been warranted. Felicity made the trip east with Rebecca, now 8, leaving Samuel to help his father. The journey that had once terrified her was now simply tedious, long hours on trains and in stations, but manageable. Rebecca was a good traveler, curious about everything they passed. Philadelphia looked smaller than Felicity remembered, grayer, more cramped. The boarding house had been sold years ago, but she found Mrs. Henderson in a small apartment, thin and frail from the illness consuming her. The old woman's face lit up when she saw Felicity. "My dear girl," she whispered. "You look so well, so strong." They spent 3 days together, and Felicity told Mrs. Henderson everything. About Yates and his kindness, about the ranch and the life they had built, about Samuel and Rebecca and the home full of love and laughter. She thanked Mrs. Henderson for having the faith to send her west, for giving her a chance at a life she never could have had staying in Philadelphia. "I worried," Mrs. Henderson admitted. "You were so frightened of everything. I thought perhaps I was sending you to disaster, but I didn't know what else to do. You needed somewhere safe, someone kind. I prayed I was making the right choice." "You were," Felicity assured her. "You gave me everything I needed, a chance and a man who understood what I needed even before I did." Mrs. Henderson passed away 2 days after Felicity and Rebecca left to return home. The news reached them through a telegram when they stopped in Chicago, and Felicity wept for the woman who had been more mother than landlady, who had cared enough to find a solution for a frightened, anxious girl with nowhere else to turn. But there was also peace in knowing that Mrs. Henderson had seen Felicity happy and settled, that she had died knowing her efforts had resulted in exactly the outcome she had hoped for. The journey home to California felt different from the journey out. Rebecca chattered about all the things they had seen, the tall buildings and the crowds, the different landscapes passing outside the train windows. And Felicity held her daughter close, grateful for this life, these people, this second chance she had been given. When they finally arrived back at the ranch, Yates and Samuel were waiting at the station. Samuel had grown taller in the weeks they'd been gone, looking less like a boy and more like a young man. Yates swept Felicity into his arms, holding her tight. "Missed you," he murmured into her hair. "House was too quiet without you and Rebecca." "Missed you too," Felicity said. "Both of you." That night, after the children were asleep, Felicity and Yates lay in bed, and she told him everything about the trip, about Mrs. Henderson's last days, about seeing Philadelphia again and realizing how much she had changed. "I'm not that girl anymore," she said wonderingly. "The one who was afraid of everything, who couldn't function in the world. I'm someone different now, someone stronger." "You were always strong," Yates said, as he had said so many times over the years. "But maybe now you can see it in yourself, not just take my word for it." "I see it," Felicity agreed. "And it's because of you, because you gave me the space and safety to become this person." "We gave it to each other," Yates said, kissing her softly. "I'm not the same man I was when you arrived either. You taught me patience and gentleness. You showed me what real courage looks like. You made this house a home and gave me a family I never dared hope for. We built this life together, love, every bit of it." The turn of the century arrived with celebration and reflection. On New Year's Eve 1899, the whole family stayed up to welcome the year 1900, and Felicity thought about everything that had changed since 1882. The frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off that stagecoach would hardly recognize the woman she had become, confident and capable, loved and loving. Samuel was now 16, tall and strong, looking more like his father every day. He had already declared his intention to remain on the ranch, to eventually take it over when Yates was ready to step back. The pride in Yates's eyes when Samuel made this announcement was evident to everyone. Rebecca, at 13, was becoming a young woman, still prone to worry and sensitivity, but learning to manage it as her mother had. She talked about perhaps becoming a teacher someday, or maybe a nurse. Felicity encouraged all her dreams, wanting her daughter to have choices and opportunities. The ranch was more prosperous than ever. The combined operation with Tom Miller had proven enormously successful, and they were considered among the most reliable suppliers of quality beef in the region. The years of hard work and careful planning had paid off in security and comfort. But more than the material success, It was the love that made everything worthwhile. The way Yates still looked at Felicity across the dinner table, his eyes warm with affection. The way Samuel and Rebecca teased each other but stood together fiercely when it mattered. The way the house felt alive with conversation and laughter, and the occasional argument that was always resolved with hugs and apologies. In 1902, Samuel began courting the daughter of another rancher, a sensible girl named Martha who shared his practical nature and his love of ranch life. Watching her son fall in love, Felicity was transported back to her own early days with Yates, remembering the fear and the uncertainty, but also the hope and the gradual unfolding of affection into deep, abiding love. Samuel and Martha married in 1903, and Yates helped them build a house on the far side of the property, setting them up with their own section of the ranch to manage. It was bittersweet, watching Samuel establish his own household, but also deeply satisfying to see him so happy and settled. Rebecca showed no interest in marriage yet, focused instead on her music and her studies. She talked about attending the normal school in San Jose to become a teacher, and while the thought of her daughter leaving made Felicity's heart ache, she supported the dream fully. In 1905, Samuel and Martha welcomed their first child, a boy they named Yates after his grandfather. Holding her grandson, Felicity marveled at the continuity of it all, the way life moved forward in cycles and patterns. This tiny person was the next generation, carrying forward the family they had built. Yates, now in his early 50s, had weathered well, still strong and capable though his hair had gone silver at the temples. He moved a bit slower than he once had, but his mind was sharp, and his love for Felicity had only deepened with time. They still sat together on the porch most evenings when weather permitted, watching the sun set over the hills they had claimed as home. "You ever regret it?" Yates asked one such evening, the question coming out of nowhere. "Marrying me, coming here." Felicity turned to look at him, surprised. "Never, not once. Why would you ask that?" "Just thinking about all the things you gave up," Yates said. "The life you might have had if you'd stayed in Philadelphia, found someone there. You came all this way, married a stranger, built a life in a place you'd never seen. That took a leap of faith." "The only life I would have had in Philadelphia was one of fear and limitation," Felicity said firmly. "You gave me freedom, Yates. You gave me the space to become who I was meant to be. You gave me love and children and a home that feels safe. You gave me everything." "You gave me just as much," Yates said, pulling her close. "Maybe more. You took a rough bachelor who knew cattle better than people and taught him how to be a husband, a father. You built beauty and warmth into every corner of my life. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I loved you plenty even then." They kissed as the sun painted the sky orange and pink. Two people who had found each other across distance and circumstance, who had built something lasting and real out of hope and patience and commitment. In 1907, Rebecca left for the normal school in San Jose, and the house felt too quiet without her bright chatter and piano playing. But she wrote long letters full of enthusiasm for her studies, and she came home during breaks with stories about her classes and her friends. Samuel and Martha had 2 more children, a girl and another boy, and the property rang with the sounds of grandchildren playing. Felicity loved having them around, teaching them to bake and telling them stories, watching them grow. Yates gradually stepped back from the hardest physical work, leaving more of the day-to-day management to Samuel while he focused on the business side and on mentoring his son. He and Tom Miller, both older now, spent more time reminiscing about the early days than planning new ventures, though they still kept sharp eyes on their operations. Life in Grass Valley changed around them too. The town grew larger, more modern, with automobiles beginning to appear on the streets alongside horses and wagons. Electricity came to town, though the ranch still relied on lanterns and candles. The world was speeding up, changing in ways that sometimes felt disorienting. But some things remained constant. The hills still turned green in winter and gold in summer. The creek still ran cold and clear through the property. The cattle still needed tending, the horses still needed caring for. And Yates and Felicity still loved each other with the same depth and certainty that had grown between them over more than 2 decades of marriage. Rebecca graduated from the normal school in 1909 and returned to Grass Valley to teach at the local school. She still lived at home, though Felicity suspected that wouldn't last forever. There was a young man, another teacher, who seemed very interested in Rebecca, and Rebecca blushed prettily whenever his name was mentioned. In 1910, on the anniversary of their marriage, Yates presented Felicity with a gift. It was a leather-bound journal, the pages blank and waiting. "What's this for?" Felicity asked, running her hand over the smooth cover. "For your story," Yates said. "I thought maybe you'd want to write it down, everything that happened. How you came here afraid of everything, and how you became the strongest, bravest woman I know. For our grandchildren and their grandchildren, so they know where they came from." Felicity was touched by the thoughtfulness of it. That evening, she opened the journal and began to write, starting with that day in 1882, when she stepped off the stagecoach in Grass Valley, terrified and uncertain, and met a cowboy who promised her safety and kept that promise every day for the rest of his life. She wrote about the fear and the gradual healing, about learning to ride and shoot, about falling in love, about the birth of their children and the building of their life together. She wrote about the hard times and the good times, about the way love could transform everything if you were patient enough to let it grow. Writing her story, Felicity realized something profound. The fear that had defined her early life hadn't been a weakness or a failure. It had been a response to feeling unsafe in a world that often wasn't kind to vulnerable young women. And Yates, with his patient understanding and his unwavering commitment to her well-being, had given her the safety she needed to heal and grow. Their story wasn't about a man rescuing a helpless woman. It was about 2 people who had found each other and built something beautiful together, each making the other stronger and better. It was about partnership and patience, about the power of consistent love and care. Over the following months, Felicity filled the journal with their history, adding to it regularly as new things happened. She wrote about Rebecca's engagement to the young teacher, about the wedding in the spring of 1911, about the way Rebecca glowed with happiness. She wrote about Samuel's growing family and his skill at managing the ranch. She wrote about Yates's health scare in 1912, when he had pneumonia and they feared they might lose him, and about his recovery and her profound relief. She wrote about the gradual slowing of their lives as they moved into their later years, the way they spent more time simply being together, less concerned with productivity and more focused on presence. The ranch ran well under Samuel's management, allowing Yates and Felicity to enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. In 1914, as tensions began rising in Europe that would eventually lead to war, Felicity and Yates celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary. They were both in their late 50s now, graying and slowing but still healthy and active. They had 6 grandchildren, with more likely on the way, and the ranch was thriving under the next generation's care. That evening they walked down to the creek, following the path they had walked countless times over the years. The willows had grown taller, the banks more defined, but the water still sang the same song it always had. "We've had a good life," Yates said, taking Felicity's hand as they sat on their favorite rock near the water. Better than I ever imagined when I sent that letter to the matrimonial agency." "What did you imagine?" Felicity asked, curious. They had never really talked about his expectations before she arrived. "Honestly, I thought I'd get a practical woman who could cook and keep house, maybe someone to talk to in the evenings. I figured we'd build a respectful partnership, help each other out. I never dreamed I'd find love, real deep love, the kind poets write about." He smiled at her. "You were such a surprise. Scared of everything, yes, but also so smart and kind and brave underneath all that fear. Watching you bloom, watching you become confident and strong, that's been one of the great privileges of my life. I thought I was coming to a life of duty and obligation," Felicity admitted. "I thought I'd have a home and security, but I'd have to pay for it by enduring a difficult marriage to a rough man who didn't understand me. Instead, I found you. Patient, gentle, understanding in ways I didn't know men could be. You gave me room to be afraid without judgment and space to heal without pressure. You loved me into wholeness." "We loved each other into wholeness," Yates corrected. "That's how it works best. Two broken pieces that fit together and make something stronger than either could be alone." They sat in companionable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere on the ranch, their grandchildren were playing, their laughter carried on the evening breeze. Samuel and Martha's house showed warm lamplight in the windows, and Rebecca and her husband's home glowed similarly in the distance. This was legacy, Felicity thought. Not just land and cattle and money passed down through generations, but love and safety and the knowledge that family meant support and understanding. Her grandchildren would grow up confident in ways she never had been as a child, because they had been shown from birth that they were valued and protected. The fear that had once ruled her life was barely a whisper now, present in certain moments but never overwhelming. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. She had learned that safety came not from hiding from the world but from having someone beside you who would face it with you. As full darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Yates helped Felicity to her feet, and they walked back to the house together, hand in hand as they had been for over 3 decades. The house welcomed them with warmth and light, with the familiar scent of home, with the accumulated memories of years of love and life. That night, as they prepared for bed, Felicity added a final entry to the journal Yates had given her. She wrote about the creek and the sunset, about the grandchildren and the legacy they were building. And then she wrote these words: "To anyone who reads this in years to come, know this. Love is patient. Love is gentle. Love gives space for growth and healing. Love keeps its promises. I came to California in 1882 afraid of everything, and a cowboy told me to fear nothing there, that I was safe. He kept that promise every day for the rest of our lives, and in keeping it, he gave me the world." She closed the journal and placed it carefully in the drawer of her nightstand, then climbed into bed beside Yates. He pulled her close, and she settled into the familiar warmth of his embrace, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the California night stretched vast and peaceful over the Broken Creek Ranch. Inside, two people who had found each other across distance and circumstance, who had built a life of love and partnership and family, slept soundly in the home they had created together, their story complete, their legacy secure, their love enduring into whatever years remained and beyond into the memories of all who would come after. The mail-order bride who had arrived afraid of everything had discovered that safety wasn't found in hiding from the world, but in finding the right person to face it with. And the cowboy who had promised her safety had discovered that keeping that promise had enriched his life beyond measure, giving him love and family and purpose deeper than he had known possible. Together, they had turned fear into courage, strangers into soulmates, and a rough California ranch into a home filled with love that would echo through generations. Their story, born of necessity and hope, had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the transformative power of patient love and unwavering commitment. And as the years continued to unfold, as children grew and grandchildren multiplied, as the ranch passed into new hands but remained rooted in the values they had established, the memory of that first day remained vivid. The frightened young woman on the dusty street, and the gentle cowboy who had looked at her with understanding eyes and said the words that would change everything. "Fear nothing here. You're safe." He had meant it then, and he meant it every day after, until those words became not just a promise but a reality, the foundation on which they built a lifetime of love.